The secure conference room at the Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia maintained an atmosphere of forced optimism, despite the intelligence reports and strategic assessments scattered across the table, documents that painted a picture of Germany's military position in late 1943 that any objective observer would have recognized as fundamentally untenable. The surrender at Stalingrad had eliminated an entire army. The defeat at Kursk had broken Germany's last major offensive capability on the Eastern Front. The loss of North Africa had opened the Mediterranean to Allied invasion. Italy had switched sides after Mussolini's fall, and the combined industrial output of the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union was producing war material in quantities that exceeded German capacity by factors approaching 10 to 1. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel stood before the maps with General Alfred Jodl, both men understanding that the rational strategic course at this juncture would be seeking a negotiated settlement before Germany's position deteriorated further, before Allied forces invaded France and opened the second front that would make Germany's strategic situation completely hopeless, and before the bombing campaign reduced German cities to rubble. Yet, when tentative suggestions about exploring peace possibilities were raised, always indirectly, always carefully framed to avoid triggering Hitler's rage, the Führer's response was absolute and uncompromising refusal, grounded in a complex mixture of ideological conviction, psychological inability to accept failure, strategic miscalculation about Allied intentions, and nihilistic determination that if he could not achieve his vision of German dominance, then Germany itself should be destroyed, rather than accept defeat on terms that contradicted everything Nazi socialism represented. Hitler's refusal to consider ending the war in 1943 emerged from multiple interconnected factors that reinforced each other to create a position from which retreat was psychologically and ideologically impossible. At the most fundamental level, Hitler's entire worldview was constructed around racial struggle, the conviction that history was determined by conflict between superior and inferior peoples, and the belief that Germany's destiny was to dominate Europe and create a continental empire that would ensure the survival and expansion of the Aryan race. Accepting negotiated peace in 1943 would mean abandoning these core ideological commitments, admitting that the racial theories on which Hitler had built his political career were wrong, and acknowledging that the thousand-year Reich he had promised was revealed as a temporary conquest, already being reversed by enemies he had characterized as racially inferior and politically weak. The psychological dimension of Hitler's refusal was equally powerful and perhaps even more resistant to rational argument than the ideological factors. Hitler had built his identity around being the leader who had restored German power after the humiliation of Versailles, who had reversed the territorial losses of World War I, who had united the German people in a great racial project. His sense of self was completely invested in this role, and acknowledging that the project had failed would require psychological transformation that Hitler was incapable of undergoing. It was not merely that ending the war would be admitting strategic error, it would be admitting that his entire understanding of himself and his historical mission had been fundamentally wrong, that the confidence he had projected for decades was based on delusions, and that his claim to lead Germany had been illegitimate from the beginning. This psychological investment in continuing the war was reinforced by Hitler's understanding of what negotiated settlement would actually mean, given the military and political situation in 1943. The Western Allies had declared their commitment to unconditional surrender at the Casablanca Conference in January 1943, explicitly rejecting the kind of negotiated peace that Hitler might have found acceptable. The Soviets had fought through years of catastrophic losses and had witnessed firsthand the genocidal character of German occupation policies in the East. They were not going to agree to peace terms that left Hitler in power or that allowed Germany to retain significant conquered territories. Any realistic peace in 1943 would have required Germany to surrender most or all of its conquests, to accept Allied occupation and fundamental restructuring of German government and society, and likely to accept war crimes trials for Nazi leadership, including Hitler himself. These were terms that Hitler could never accept, partly because they contradicted his ideological vision, but also because accepting them would mean personal destruction. Hitler understood that genuine peace negotiations would require him to step down or would result in his eventual arrest and trial. The Allies were not going to negotiate with Hitler and then allow him to remain in power. The entire purpose of unconditional surrender policy was to ensure Nazi leadership was completely removed and could never threaten Europe again. So, from Hitler's perspective, negotiated peace meant not just German defeat, but his personal destruction. And the choice was not between continuing to fight versus achieving acceptable peace, but between continuing to fight versus accepting certain personal catastrophe. The strategic dimension of Hitler's refusal involved his assessment of Allied unity and his conviction that the coalition arrayed against Germany would eventually fracture due to ideological differences between the Western democracies and the Soviet Union. This assessment had some basis in reality. There were genuine tensions between Western allies and Soviets about post-war arrangements, about spheres of influence, about the future of Eastern Europe. Hitler believed these tensions would grow as the war progressed, that eventually the Western powers would recognize that Soviet expansion was a greater threat than German power, and that political opportunities would emerge for Germany to exploit these divisions.
This strategic calculation was fundamentally flawed because it underestimated the depth of Allied commitment to Germany's complete defeat, and it overestimated the differences among the Allies. Yes, Britain and America had ideological differences with the Soviet Union, but all three powers understood that those differences could be addressed after Germany was defeated, and that allowing Germany to survive as a significant power would be strategically catastrophic for all of them. The management of Allied tensions through conferences at Tehran, Yalta, and eventually Potsdam demonstrated that the coalition could maintain unity through to final German defeat, despite disagreements about post-war arrangements. But Hitler convinced himself that patient waiting would eventually produce the political miracle he needed, that continuing to fight would keep Germany in the game until Allied unity fractured, and that any negotiated settlement before that fracturing occurred would be premature and would sacrifice Germany's interests. This conviction allowed him to reframe the military defeats of 1943 not as evidence that the war was lost, but as temporary setbacks that had to be endured until the political situation changed. The loss at Stalingrad was devastating, but did not fundamentally alter the strategic balance. Kursk had failed, but had not destroyed German defensive capabilities. North Africa was a secondary theater, whose loss did not threaten Germany's core territories, and Italy's defection was manageable through German occupation of the northern two-thirds of the peninsula. Each rationalization for continuing the war in 1943 was individually plausible enough that Hitler could convince himself it was valid, and collectively they created a framework that made ending the war appear strategically unsound, even though any objective assessment would have recognized that Germany's position was deteriorating and would only worsen with time. The problem was that Hitler's assessments were not objective. They were shaped by ideological preconceptions, psychological needs, and a fundamental inability to distinguish between what he wanted to be true and what evidence actually demonstrated. The military leadership's response to the question of ending the war in 1943 was divided and complicated by the command structure that gave Hitler absolute authority over strategic decisions. Some generals, particularly those who had witnessed the carnage on the Eastern Front and who understood the arithmetic of industrial war, believed that seeking negotiated settlement was Germany's only rational option. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, perhaps the Wehrmacht's most capable operational commander, understood that Germany could not win a war of attrition against enemies with overwhelming material superiority, that tactical excellence could delay but not prevent defeat, and that the only question was whether Germany would seek terms while still possessing some bargaining power, or would fight until complete destruction. But Manstein and other generals who held similar views faced multiple obstacles to advocating for ending the war. First, Hitler had made clear that such advocacy would be considered defeatism and would result in immediate relief from command and possible worse consequences. The purges following the July 1944 assassination attempt would demonstrate what happened to officers who actively worked against Hitler's continuation of the war. But even before that plot, the atmosphere was such that openly arguing for peace negotiations was professionally and personally dangerous. Second, the generals' oaths were to Hitler personally rather than to Germany in the abstract, and the military culture emphasized obedience to lawful authority, even when that authority made decisions the subordinates considered strategically unsound. Third, many generals shared Hitler's conviction that unconditional surrender was unacceptable, that some form of negotiated peace was necessary, but that achieving such peace required continuing to fight to improve Germany's bargaining position, a logic that trapped them in supporting continuation of the war, even when they recognized it was probably lost. The alternative voices arguing for peace in 1943 came primarily from outside the military command structure, from civilians who understood the economic and social costs of continued warfare, and from some Nazi officials who recognized that the regime's survival might require compromise. These voices were systematically marginalized or silenced through the Nazi power structure that made Hitler's authority absolute and that treated dissent as treason. The few attempts to reach out to Allied powers about possible peace terms were either unauthorized initiatives by individuals without authority to negotiate on Germany's behalf, or were probes that received such clear rejections that they demonstrated the futility of expecting negotiated settlement that Hitler would find acceptable.
The ideological dimension of Hitler's refusal to end the war involved his understanding of what National Socialism meant and what it required. The Nazi project was not merely about German power or territorial expansion. It was about racial reorganization of Europe, about creating hierarchies based on perceived racial worth, about eliminating populations considered inferior or threatening. The genocidal policies that characterized German occupation in the East were not incidental to Nazi ideology, but were central to it, and accepting peace terms that would require abandoning these policies was, from Hitler's perspective, abandoning the core Nazi mission. This created a situation where peace was ideologically impossible, even if it had been strategically desirable. Hitler could not agree to withdraw from occupied territories and allow Jewish populations to survive, could not accept that Slavic peoples would not be subordinated to German racial dominance, could not abandon the Lebensraum project that had been the geopolitical justification for the entire Eastern campaign. The war aims that Hitler had established were so fundamentally at odds with any peace the Allies would accept that there was no negotiating space where compromise was possible. This was not a war about border adjustments or spheres of influence that could be settled through diplomatic haggling. It was a war about the fundamental organization of European society and about whether Nazi racial ideology would be allowed to be implemented. The economic factors that should have argued for ending the war in 1943 were visible to anyone who examined Germany's industrial situation objectively. Albert Speer, as armaments minister, had managed impressive increases in German weapons production through rationalization and efficiency improvements. But Speer also understood that German production was being exceeded by Allied output and that the gap was growing rather than shrinking. American factories were producing aircraft, tanks, vehicles, and ships in quantities that seemed impossible by traditional European industrial standards. Soviet industry, relocated beyond the Urals and thus safe from German attack, was producing weapons in numbers that allowed the Red Army to sustain offensives despite suffering casualties that would have broken other military forces. British industry, supplemented by American Lend-Lease, was maintaining forces in multiple theaters while also contributing to the strategic bombing campaign against Germany. Speer's attempts to explain these economic realities to Hitler were frustrated by the Führer's conviction that will and determination could overcome material disadvantages, that German quality would triumph over Allied quantity, and that wonder weapons under development would restore the balance. The V-weapons program, the jet aircraft development, the new U-boat designs, each represented technological advancement that Hitler believed would decisively shift the war's trajectory. The reality was that these weapons came too late, in too few numbers, and could not compensate for the overwhelming material superiority the Allies possessed across all categories of military production. The strategic bombing campaign that was devastating German cities throughout 1943 provided another argument for ending the war before further destruction occurred. The combined British night bombing and American daylight raids were systematically destroying Germany's urban centers, killing civilians by the thousands, disrupting industrial production, and demonstrating that Germany could not defend its own territory against Allied air power. The human and economic costs of this campaign were enormous and growing.
Yet Hitler's response was to insist on continued resistance rather than to consider whether ending the war might save German cities and population from further destruction. The nihilistic dimension of Hitler's refusal to end the war emerged more clearly in 1943 than it had in earlier years when German victory still seemed possible. Hitler's statements to close associates began to reveal a conviction that if Germany could not achieve dominance, then Germany's destruction was appropriate, that the German people had proven themselves unworthy of his leadership by failing to achieve victory, and that their suffering was justified by their weakness. This nihilism would become more explicit in the war's final years, culminating in the Nero Decree ordering destruction of German infrastructure. But the seeds of this thinking were visible in 1943 when Hitler began to frame continued fighting not as a path to victory, but as a test of German will and determination. This nihilistic framework made ending the war impossible because it removed the normal calculus that would lead leaders to seek peace when continued fighting became counterproductive. Traditional strategic logic suggests that when achieving maximum objectives becomes impossible, rational leaders seek to achieve whatever lesser objectives remain attainable while minimizing further losses. But Hitler's logic was different. Since total victory was the only acceptable outcome, and since total victory was becoming impossible, the appropriate response was total commitment to fighting, regardless of costs, with destruction being preferable to compromise. The 1943 situation presented several moments when ending the war might have been considered, but when Hitler's refusal was decisive. After Stalingrad in February, Germany had suffered a catastrophic defeat, but still controlled vast territories and maintained substantial military forces. A negotiated settlement at that point might have salvaged something from the Eastern conquests and might have avoided the subsequent 2 years of destruction. After Kursk in July, Germany's offensive capability was broken, but defensive capabilities remained substantial, and some settlement preserving German control of core territories might have been imaginable if Hitler had been willing to abandon the extreme war aims that made the conflict fundamentally non-negotiable. After Italy's surrender in September, Germany faced the prospect of defending against Allied invasion from the south while maintaining forces in the east against Soviet pressure and preparing for the inevitable Western Allied invasion across the Channel. The strategic overextension was obvious, the resource constraints were severe, and the trajectory was clearly toward progressive deterioration of Germany's military position.
Yet Hitler's response was to occupy northern Italy, to commit forces to defending the peninsula, and to maintain the multi-front war that Germany could not sustain, rather than to consider whether the transformed strategic situation required fundamental reassessment of war aims and possibilities. Each of these decision points revealed the same pattern: military logic suggesting that Germany's position was unsustainable and that seeking settlement was rational; Hitler's ideological and psychological framework making such settlement impossible to consider; and the command structure making Hitler's refusal decisive, regardless of what military advisors might have recommended. The result was that 1943 passed with Germany moving from a position of substantial weakness to a position of near hopelessness, with hundreds of thousands of additional German soldiers and civilians dying in fighting that was progressively less likely to achieve any positive outcome for Germany, all because Hitler could not psychologically or ideologically accept what military reality was demonstrating. The alternative history question of what might have happened if Hitler had sought peace in 1943 is ultimately unanswerable but illuminating. The Western Allies were committed to unconditional surrender and were not going to negotiate terms that left Hitler in power or that allowed Germany to retain significant conquests. The Soviets had suffered over 10 million casualties by 1943 and were not going to accept peace that did not include substantial territorial gains and security guarantees. So, realistically, peace in 1943 would have required Hitler's removal from power, German acceptance of Allied occupation, and fundamental political restructuring, and probably war crimes trials for Nazi leadership. These conditions were so far from what Hitler could accept that peace in 1943 was effectively impossible, regardless of military situation. Hitler's refusal was thus not primarily about strategic assessment of whether Germany could still win, but about his psychological and ideological inability to accept the only peace that was available. The choice was not between continuing to fight versus achieving acceptable settlement, but between continuing to fight versus accepting personal and political destruction. And Hitler chose to fight not because he believed victory was likely, but because the alternative was unacceptable. The consequences of Hitler's refusal to end the war in 1943 played out over the subsequent 18 months. The Normandy invasion opened the second front that made Germany's strategic situation hopeless. The Soviet offensives drove German forces back across Eastern Europe. The bombing campaign reduced German cities to ruins, and eventually Allied forces advanced from east and west to meet in the heart of Germany itself. The casualties suffered in this period, military and civilian, German and Allied, were enormous, and many resulted directly from Hitler's decision to continue fighting when rational assessment suggested the war was lost. When examining why Hitler refused to end the war in 1943, the answer involves understanding that for Hitler, ending the war on any terms that were actually available was psychologically impossible, ideologically unacceptable, and personally catastrophic. His worldview did not allow for the kind of compromise that peace would require. His sense of self was so invested in the Nazi project that its failure was his failure in ways he could not accept, and his understanding of Allied intentions was accurate enough to recognize that peace meant not just German defeat, but his own destruction. So he chose to fight on, convincing himself that political miracles would transform the strategic situation, that wonder weapons would restore the balance, that Allied unity would fracture, and that determination would somehow overcome the material realities that made German victory impossible. This choice to fight on when rational strategy suggested seeking peace was not made from military logic or strategic assessment, but from psychological necessity, ideological commitment, and nihilistic conviction that destruction was preferable to compromise. The tragedy was not merely that Hitler made this choice, but that the Nazi system he had created made his choice decisive. that the German military and political leadership either shared his convictions or lacked the courage and mechanisms to override his decisions, and that millions of people, German and Allied, military and civilian, paid with their lives for a leader's refusal to accept what military reality had already determined and what any objective observer could see, that the war was lost, and that fighting on would only determine how total the destruction would be, not where the destruction would end.